Aliette, welcome to the show. So excited to have you here.
Hi, thank you so much for having me.
So, we're going to be talking about a topic that I get a lot of questions about as someone who is divorced and is now engaged and planning to get married again. A lot of people are kind of like, we want to talk more about how we actually navigate this whole process of divorce. And for me, I feel like I got really lucky in the sense that I had a postnuptial agreement. I kind of did my due diligence. I didn't have children. So it was a lot less of a complicated situation than a lot of people can potentially find themselves in. But I want to kind of get the whole conversation going with learning more about your personal story, Aliette, and what makes you passionate about this topic. And then we're going to dive into all the nitty gritty when it comes to how to financially survive divorce.
Great. So I wanted to be a lawyer. I was always interested in family law because I enjoy the personal aspects of it. Like my day to day is not just about money, even though money is a huge part of what I do. And it is very important because money hits people at every level, right? It hits you emotionally. It hits you in the physical world. It's a very important factor, but the human component of what I do is what is really fascinating to me. I'm a child of divorce. My parents were divorced. They did it very amicably. So I was very fortunate that that was the case. And then I was divorced 8 years ago. And I have, proud to say that also managed to do it amicably. It was my experience personally that makes my job not purely academic for me. So I've lived it. I know it. I'm a single mom. I have two kids that I primarily responsible for. So I kind of have been in this world a really long time. And so I've been running my own law firm. I've been in family law since 2001 when I started as a law clerk. I've been an attorney for over 20 years, and I've had my own practice for over 15 years. So I see it from a multidimensional perspective. And that was actually what the catalyst for me founding thequickdivorce.com, because the traditional route of divorce is always going to be necessary. There are always going to be cases of people where their asset situation is so complex. They're in several countries. There's too many types of business interests or whatever. But the average person does not need to spend 10, 20, 30, $100,000 on a traditional divorce, So my passion for wanting to change the conversation around divorce stems from my own personal experience with it and how much better it was for me and for my children to just have it resolved amicably. Because at the end of the day, we know what the court is going to do in a variety of ways. Look, I don't have a crystal ball. We can never guarantee a result, but we have experience and we have statutes that are pretty clear on how the court is going to rule. So when there's a margin of error in what you are going to decide on in terms of the financial value of an asset, for example, like the value of a house, right? I mean, you might think it's one number and your spouse might think it's another. The prudent thing to do is to either just get an appraisal and say, we're going to live and die by that number, or do a cost benefit analysis of what it's going to cost you to get the difference of what you're fighting for. I always tell people, like, divorce is a very emotionally wrought situation because we make it that way. Like, we humans make it that way. At the end of the day, divorce is a legal process. There's no emotion to it. It's a series of rules that you need to apply to your situation. And the best way to do that is with con la mente fría, like we say in Spanish, right? With your mind focused on the solution and emotions to be dealt with your therapist. Because seriously, even though I feel like I have an honorary degree in psychology, it's also one of the parts that I started right at the beginning saying what I'm interested in is the people that I work with, right? I try to make the worst situation in their life be as good as it can be to make it as smooth as possible and stay away from making mountains out of molehills. And I think we're in a world now where because of the digital push that the pandemic gave us, we know now that we can do things electronically. We don't need to make things more complicated. There are solutions that allow us to preserve our relationships as much as possible if you can just expedite and be efficient with how you accomplish your legal proceeding. And so that's kind of my story in a nutshell. With regard to the book that I wrote, a lot of women would come and sit in front of me. And back then it was in person, and I'd go through my little list. And when I would get down to, so where do you bank? I would get, I don't know, my check card says Bank of America. And they had no idea because they were completely blind in the finances of their life. And look, as a person who has never been able to release that part in my adult life. Like in my adult life, I have always been financially responsible for myself. I mean, it sounds like a fantasy to just be like, I have no idea what the mortgage is. I have no idea what the, like, that sounds like a dream world, but at the end of the day, for a lot of people, that ends up being their worst nightmare. And so in my book, I advocate for financial intelligence. And the reason and what I advocate for is maybe preserving your marriage if you don't abdicate your role in it, if you are a participant to the extent that you can be, right? There are relationships where, the deal you're making is you're never going to know what's behind the curtain. Even still, there are tactics that you can employ to preserve some of your financial dignity and some of your financial control, because it is very empowering to be able to walk away from a situation if you need to, because you're financially independent, or at least have enough resources to bridge the gap. So that's kind of me in a nutshell.
Yeah, absolutely. So, when I was writing my book, one of the statistics that jumped out at me right away was the fact that I think like 70% of divorces are being initiated by the woman in a heterosexual couple, which I'm just like, why is this happening? Are we really just like at a time in society where women are just like, I'm not going to take anybody's shit anymore. Like, we don't have to. Like, what's happening?
I think that yes, the short answer is that when you don't have to put up with somebody's shit, you don't. I mean, in my personal case, I didn't even think of the finance. Like, it was not a factor in my decision.
Mm-hmm. Like, it wasn't a reason to have to stay.
It was not a reason to have to stay. It wasn't a reason to go. It wasn't a factor. We just happened to grow apart in my case. And why be unhappy? And I also do not believe in the whole like stay together for the children thing. Like, I don't believe in that. Like, I think if you can manage to preserve your relationship and co-parent in a healthy way, it's much better for children to have two happy parents than to be in this relationship where it's not healthy. Like, I think being happy is a very important thing. And I don't mean like rainbows and butterfly happy, right? I mean healthy self-care happy, right?
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I think we have to look at how women's earning power has evolved over the past few decades, especially since the 1960s and 70s with the women's rights era. Like, we are not in the same time that our abuelitas were, where they were just completely financially subjected to whatever their husbands had going on because they just did not have that earning power to really create their own financial independence.
Agreed, 100%. And I think we have a long way to go. I mean, I don't want to sidetrack the conversation, but I mean, we're still not making equal pay, which to me is ridiculous at this juncture. And we still have, as women, we still have some mindset work to do in how we approach our work life and our negotiating power in the workplace and in every situation. But yeah, I agree with you. We are not in that situation anymore. And that probably is the reason why so many women are able to walk away when a situation no longer serves them.
Mm-hmm. Now, I also find that, especially in the Latino community, there is still a lot of stigma around divorce. And there's also a lot of stigma around conversations about prenups. What have you found have been kind of the common themes that people will maybe not want to have these conversations about, especially like a prenup when you're planning to get married? What are some of the things that are like mindset barriers that you're noticing?
I think you nailed it in the question. It is a cultural thing. I represent a lot of clients from different parts of the world, Venezuela, Mexico, Peru, Cubans, obviously, and the Americanized people from those countries, they have a little bit of an easier time having those conversations, right? Because they view it it's a financial thing. It's not a relationship. It's not speaking to my value of your relationship or my perception of your value in the relationship is what I meant to say. In some Latin cultures, it is the embedded, entrenched perception that women do not work, that their entire goal in life is to be somebody's wife who will then support them. And if you don't accomplish that goal, you're essentially a failure. So I think that's the first mindset change and shift that needs to come into play, because what happens in a lot of those situations is those women are forced to tolerate certain behaviors from their partners that for many women otherwise would be untenable. So I think that's the first, right? It's great if that's the situation you fall in, but it's not your God-given objective to be in that situation, and that you're not a horrible mother because you also have a career. Because there, culturally, I think that there's a struggle there. So I think women come at it from that perspective of like, wait, but I am supposed to be supported. Why are you going to ask me to sign a prenup because you're trying to screw me? You're going to leave me with nothing. And then of course, if you're coming at it from a perspective of I'm never going to be self-sufficient because that's the role that I think I'm supposed to be in, then you're living in a lot of fear. There's a lot of fear there that the partner, by virtue of making them sign a prenup, it's like a get out of jail free card for them, right? And it's not true. It's patently false. A lot of prenups do provide for the spouse. A lot of prenups do set parameters that actually leave a spouse in a decent position. If you're looking at it from the payor perspective, if you've inherited money from your family, if you have money that you are bringing into a marriage, like you should be able to protect that. And I think if you're a spouse that's coming into a marriage, looking at it as a partnership, that's the other thing, right? It's in many cultures, particularly ours, I don't think that marriage is viewed as a partnership. There's always a hierarchy, and women willfully put themselves in the lower place. And all of that generates a lot of fear. And so it's all kind of mangled and tangled. And I agree with you that there is still a lot of stigma around divorce, but I have noticed that it's starting to dissipate, where women and men are both looking at it in a different way and more open to the idea because, well, it's just the world we live in now. I think there is a little bit more of an opening of the mind.
Well, and I think we have to look at the data that suggests that folks are getting married at older ages on average. And so you are having more time to acquire assets. Whereas, like back in my parents' day, like you marry your high school sweetheart, right? At 18, y'all ain't got shit. So it's like, what are we actually even talking about when it comes to like asset protection? You have nothing. But more and more common, folks are coming into marriages with potential real estate investments and stock accounts and all types of things. And so I think we're in a situation now where women are having to take on these quote unquote rich white man problems because we're just living in a different world.
Right. Well, we are. And again, that's a very valid and good point, right? Is that people are getting married older. But I find that in the Latin community, they're still getting married relatively young.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, because obviously that's one of like the milestones in our culture of like, you have not made it. You're not a successful adult unless you've gotten married.
Right.
Yeah.
So you see more of like the 20 something marriage. Whereas I think in an Americanized culture, there's more of a, you get married kind of in your 30s, right? You don't, and that's perfect, right? Like I find like that's a great time to get married, like in your 30s. Like I tell my kids, like, I don't want them to get married until they're in their 30s.
No, you don't know anything about yourself as an adult in your 20s. So highly recommend like get all the stuff out of your system before you decide to pick somebody because you barely know who you are. Okay, so one of the questions that I get a lot when it comes to these conversations around prenups is like, how do you even bring this up? I think a lot of people are like stressed out that it's going to start some drama in the relationship. All of a sudden, your partner's going to be like, oh, so like, are you just here for a cash grab? You don't trust me. You're already planning to get divorced. So how can we actually have these conversations in a way that does not cause like an emotionally charged situation?
Well, I think directly and as quickly as possible. It's not something that you do 6 weeks before your wedding. I think immediately after the engagement, there needs to be an open and frank conversation before you've sent out invitations to your wedding, before everybody in the world knows that you're engaged to be married. I think this is a conversation that needs to be had. In fact, it should probably be had before you get engaged, to be honest. And I think it's directly and matter of factly, expressing the reasons that you have, which are the same reasons that everybody else has. Like, in fact, I would argue that having a prenup puts the financial pressure takes it off. I've had cases where people get divorced because there's no prenup. And every year that passes, she gets more rights. Every year that passes, I'm still in a short term marriage. If I wait another 2 years, now I'm in moderate term marriage. Because people, I mean, the internet is full of information. It's not like in RJ where you had to go to Britannica on your shelf, you know, for information. Now you can Google what's the alimony law in my state, and they see, I mean, not that it's happened a lot, but it has happened to me where people have come and said, I need to get divorced because I don't think this is going to go well. It's not going well. And the longer I wait, the more rights this person's going to get against me. So I think having a prenup takes that pressure off. It also puts everybody on equal footing, right? You know exactly what is going to happen in the event of a divorce. And again, I think it shows more of a financial motivation for marrying somebody if you don't want to marry, if you don't want to have a prenup. I mean, I would flip that and say, you're not marrying me for my money. What do you care about the prenup? Because if you're not going to come after, and I've been working on this business for 15 years and I've built it to something, and you think you're entitled to 50% of my sweat equity for the last 15 years? No. And I would not think that I'm entitled to somebody's sweat equity for 20 years just because now we're in love.
Right.
I think the conversation needs to be cut and dry. And then you'll know, actually, before you get engaged, if this is the right person for you. And I get that that's scary. It's very easy for me to say from the comfort of this chair, on this computer. I understand that I'm making it sound like it's no big deal. I understand that it's hard, but as adults, we have to do hard things and we have to come at situations without fear of what the result is going to be.
Yeah. And I think honestly, like if you can't have a conversation around prenups and protecting your financial assets, there's going to be a lot of other hard conversations that you're probably not going to be able to have in marriage, which is a red flag for me. Okay. So what does a prenup actually cover? There's a lot of confusion as to like what actually goes into this document and how do we actually get one?
So what goes into a prenup is the financial issues that affect your marriage, right? So the division of assets and liabilities, spousal support, and actually we include death rights. You cannot contract away children's rights, at least not in the state of Florida, in a prenup. So you cannot say when our children are born, we're going to have equal time sharing. That you cannot do. You cannot say when our children are born, you're going to pay X amount in child support. Those are unenforceable provisions. You also, at least in the state of Florida, cannot waive your temporary support, which is during the pendency of the proceedings, right? You went from the date of filing till the day you finish your divorce. There's that temporary phase where you're entitled to some things. You're not allowed to waive that, although we do can circle around that. Primarily, it is to protect assets, to shield the other party from liability, because if I keep an asset, then I keep the liability, and to regulate spousal support. So a lot of times we see things like step-ups, where if you're married from 0 to 3 years or 0 to 5, that party will get this amount. Some people do it in a monthly way. Some people do lump sums. It all depends, right? Mm-hmm. It depends on the specific financial circumstances of the parties. And where do you get one? Any family law attorney can draft one for you. And I think it's important to go to someone in family law, because even though our colleagues in other areas think that all we do is best interest of the child, there is a lot of nuance that goes into it. And it's important to know that you're negotiating against what could happen in court. So having that experience in family court adds a lot of value to the drafting of a prenup.
Mm-hmm. And so would you recommend that both parties have separate attorneys for this process, or can the same attorney work with both?
No.
Okay. So you want to get each person wants their own legal representation to essentially act on your best behalf.
Correct.
Okay.
Yes. I mean, one lawyer is prohibited from representing two parties. And secondly, for the person who's requesting the prenup and has the assets to protect, you definitely want to have a lawyer on the other side, so that spouse can't claim they didn't understand. They read it, but they felt pressured. The wedding was coming. I didn't understand. Nobody explained it to me. She was on your side. You want to avoid those arguments, right? Everybody get their own lawyer. If English is not the primary language of the other spouse, have the agreement translated, or make sure that the lawyer that represents them is fluent in the language of your spouse so that they can sign off and say this was translated verbally, word for word to the spouse, because you want to avoid arguments down the road that can have your agreement set aside.
Yeah. Okay, so is a prenup something that's like a one and done, like you just get it done and you never look at it again, or like what's your recommendation?
A prenup can be a one and done for sure. I don't see those cases, right? Because when they come to me, it's because they are getting divorced and now we're going to use the prenup. I would say that prenups have certain elements to it that you have to be very careful at the drafting and in the negotiating. You don't want to be overreaching. If you have significant wealth, you don't want to leave the other spouse with nothing because it's an unfair agreement. So there is a lot of thought that should go into a prenup. It's not like a form that you print off the internet and you're good to go. Even, with us that we have, obviously we work off of forms, but every case has its nuance. And you also want to make sure that you exchange a lot of discovery and you're very open and honest about what you have so that you can see what the other party is waiving. Do some people contest agreements? Absolutely. But that's just part of the game sometimes. And you can always agree to give more than what's in the prenup. It's unusual that people will do that. But we do sometimes use the prenup as the beginning of a negotiation for a marital settlement agreement, which is the document that you sign when you reach agreement in your divorce proceedings.
Okay. So let's say that you got married and you're just listening to this episode and you're like, shit, I did not get a prenup. What is my option?
You do a postnup. It's the same as a prenup, but it's a postnuptial agreement. There are little variances in the discovery that we have to do, but it functions in the same exact way. It's basically a determination of your rights and obligations and your duties and your liberties with regard to your finances. So it's just as valid. We do them not as often as we do prenuptial agreements, but postnups are not a random thing. They're not unusual. It's because this happened, especially if you got married a little young or you don't come from a kind of family that would have brought it to your attention. You learn about it later. People do it all the time. A lot of times they do it as a way to save their marriage, believe it or not. When there's a lot of argument about the finances, a postnup is kind of a way to put everybody on the same page about what their expectations are. Finances are one of the main reasons behind divorces. You have infidelity and you have finances. They're the top reasons why people get divorced. So a postnup can actually help center everyone and put them on the same page.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I took the postnuptial route because I was planning on becoming a full-time entrepreneur. And so for me, it was important to retain the rights to my business and not let that be something that could potentially be lost, or I'd have to pay my ex half of the value of the company. And it definitely came in handy, y'all. So just because you did not get a prenup does not mean that you cannot protect your assets. A postnuptial agreement is something a lot of people don't know exists, but is absolutely something you should be considering, especially if you have some like big financial goals, or you see your financial situation changing drastically, or you see your relationship potentially like deteriorating. It's better to take the proactive approach for sure.
Agreed. 100%.
So one of the things that really causes me a lot of like angst in these conversations is when I talk to women who are post-divorce and they express like how financially devastating the whole process has been. I think I read a statistic where like at least 25% of women who file for divorce or get divorced end up like living in poverty. And so it's really important for me to have these conversations with folks like yourself so that we can protect ourselves financially as women, because you just never know what's going to happen. So what is your best advice for maintaining your financial security so that you don't end up in that situation after divorce?
I would say never stop working. I would never walk away. Not everybody has to be an entrepreneur like us. Not everybody has to be the CEO, but there are so many, especially now with this, again, post-COVID world where everything is digital and you can work from home. You don't have to even work full time, but like keeping your toe in whatever industry it is that you are in is the best way because then you can go back to it It's a difficult question to answer because everybody's financial circumstances are so different. And it also depends on who you divorce. I mean, there are women who get divorced and end up making more than some PhDs and professionals that I know just because they married this person that can provide that way. But that's not the norm. Like the average woman is not going to leave a divorce with that kind of a circumstance. So I imagine that it must be very difficult to have not worked for 10 years and now all of a sudden you have to work. And then when you left you were much younger and you had that energy of building and then you walked away from that. And so I think if you keep yourself in the workforce to some degree, it makes it a lot easier to ramp it up. Because what I hear from women who are, it's, well, now I can't get a job because I haven't worked in this many years and I don't know what's going on. I don't know what's happening in my industry. And yeah, I was in sales, but the sales force is completely different now. And you can eliminate a lot of that if you just keep a little part-time. I mean, kids go to school from 8 a.m. to 3 o'clock, and then they're in like 8,000 extracurricular activities. I mean, you have time. You know what I mean? Like, yeah. I mean, obviously there's exceptions to every rule. The other thing I would say is that during your marriage, if you choose not to work, during your marriage, you have to be accountable for the finances in your house. You need to know what things cost. You need to know what money there is, because a lot of times in these situations where women are left with nothing, there's a lot of tricking, there's a lot of grabbing that happens to marital money because you're not minding the store. And I know that sounds terrible, but it's the reality. It's very easy to move money out of an account if nobody's looking at what you're doing. And so having some kind of accountability, going to the accountant with your husband when it's time to file the taxes, not just blindly signing, is a good place to start, because there you see everything. The tax returns are like an onion, right? It's just the shell. You need to see what's behind those numbers. And, when there are women who are on a budget, right, because they don't work and then the husbands put them on a budget, a lot of the time when they reach out to me, they have a credit card and all they have is a credit card. And my advice to them is always, whatever that budget is, he has to give it to you in cash. You should have a credit card for emergencies, but your budget should be given to you in cash. First of all, because then nobody knows what you're doing. I mean, if every day it's like everything you do, everywhere you go, you're being followed, which I would be very uncomfortable with that. And secondly, you save some of that money. Like you take a portion and you save it. You don't spend the entire amount because you need to have your own little nest egg.
Mm-hmm. It is so important. I have a sister who has a podcast that's all about like domestic violence. And one of the things she talks about is financial abuse. And this is something that a lot of people are potentially going through and they have no idea. And something as simple as your spouse not wanting to be transparent about the finances is a huge red flag. Like, this is not something that you should take lightly because it can be honestly the matter between your financial survival or not if you are being kept in the dark on purpose in these types of situations.
Yes. And it happens all the time. And that's the thing about the credit card. I mean, they'll go to Publix or to their supermarket and the card doesn't pass and they can't buy groceries anymore. And what do you do when you don't even know where your family's money is? So I think it's shitty for a spouse to do that. But I think as women, we need to take personal responsibility for the decisions that we make and not tolerate it from the get-go. I know that's easier said than done, in some cases, right? But it would be my advice to any young woman who's getting married or of any age, that if you are not already financially independent, that you have that conversation with your spouse of, I don't want to be kept in the dark. I'm not going to work because you make enough money and I want to be home with my kids and that's what I want to do. Great, fine. You need to stay on top of what is happening in your house.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so what do you say to people who are like, I don't think I need a prenup or a postnup because we don't actually have any shared bank accounts. Like I have my stuff, he has his stuff. And so if we were to get divorced, I don't see what the problem is.
Right. I've heard that a lot. So the problem is that once you are married, if you are going to use those separate accounts for your paycheck to be deposited to that savings account is money that's coming from your earnings, that is marital. Doesn't matter whose name it's in. So the prenup would say every account in my name alone remains mine regardless of how I use it. Every bank account in his or her name remains the property of that person regardless of how it's used, because you get into commingling arguments, right? Well, it doesn't matter. I didn't do a prenup because all my money is inherited. I've heard that one too. Well, and what'd you do with that money? In 10 years, did you not touch it? Oh, no, that's how I bought our house. That's how I paid for vacations. That's how we paid for the school. I mean, guess what? You have opened yourself up to an argument of commingling, because if that account is how you support your family, you have, in a sense, commingled that account. And so why not just have an agreement that says that that account and any account that springs from that account is your property? It's not a super complicated thing to do. And also, nobody has a crystal ball, right? Like, you don't know. Maybe now you don't have much. If you're getting married very young, maybe you don't have anything yet. And so I hear that a lot. Oh, well, but we didn't have anything when we got married. But you don't know what the future is going to hold for you. And so I think it would behoove anybody to have an agreement that clearly delineates how the finances are going to be separated.
One of the things that I've heard, this wasn't my personal experience, and I feel like it probably has a lot to do with the fact that I had a post-nup, but that your assets can be frozen once you file for divorce. And then it's like very difficult potentially to get access to funds to get that apartment or whatever it is. So what can you anticipate happening once you file for divorce, like financially?
Assets are frozen in rare situations, right? Where like you're like completely paralyzed because there's a fear of dissipation, right? That someone's going to take all the money and run. So then we would get what's called an injunction in order to prevent the account from being dissipated. And we involve the banks, and that's a real freezing of the accounts. What normally happens is that there's a status quo that's supposed to be preserved. And so in order to make big moves like purchasing a new apartment, there has to be a consensus. At that point, once a divorce is initiated, you're under the purview of the court now. And so what you do with the money has to be accounted for. But it's not technically that the money is frozen. It's just you're supposed to maintain the status quo, meaning if you're spending at a level 3, you can't now start spending at a level 8, right? So that's the kind of thing that, some people I can imagine interpret that as freezing. It's not really a frozen count. It's just that now you're not so free to move things around without consensus.
Okay. Now, let's talk about divorce and children. One of the common things that I've seen is women potentially like move to another state for their husband's jobs, and then they're going to get divorced and they want to go back to their home state to have a better support system, go back to where abuela lives and all that stuff. Can you just like pick up your kids and move?
No, you can't. It can be pretty sad sometimes, right? Because you see that women move following their partners for their job. And then maybe that partner, his whole family is there. And then they're kind of alone, and if a divorce happens, they're cut off from that family. And now they're really alone. And you can't just pick up and move. You can't do it without permission of the court. It's a relocation trial.
How do you navigate that? Like, how do you have a conversation that allows you to potentially like co-parent out of state?
Well, people co-parent out of state all the time, but it has to be by agreement or by court order. If there's a party who, say, one is in Florida and the other's in North Carolina, there's what we call long distance parenting plans. So the parent who has the child the majority of the time would cooperate with the other parent so that they get extra time in summer, or maybe they get some extra holidays, or they get spring break every year because the parent that doesn't have them has to get some makeup time. And so that's how we do it. And now, again, thanks to technology, there's the FaceTime communication, there's a Zoom communication, so kids and the parent can see each other and talk on a regular basis. And so we see it happen successfully pretty often. And also, we live in a pretty mobile world where it's easy to get from one place to the other for the most part. So that's not the worst part. The difficult part is getting the permission to go.
Yeah, I was going to ask about that. Like, what if you just have soon to be ex-spouse that's just like, no? Like, what options do you have?
You have to petition the court for permission.
Okay. I guess you have to somehow substantiate that it's more beneficial to move versus like staying there.
Correct. It's a balance of the interest of the child. So there's a set of factors, right? There's like A through like not Z, maybe like T or something. It's a lot. It's a long list of factors. And the court evaluates them to see which merits more, right? And also like there's one parent who has the facility to travel more than another one. I mean, it's a complicated case and they're difficult cases because you can't meet in the middle. You're either going or you're not. With money, you can meet in the middle. There's always a number. But with a relocation, it's also like, what's the relocation, right? Are you talking about going from what, like I said, from Florida to North Carolina? Or are you talking about moving to another continent? Or are you talking about moving across the country with a 3-hour time difference and a 5 to 6 hour flight? Those things make it more complicated. So it really depends on the particulars of the case.
Okay. What do we do if you want to file for divorce, but your partner disappears or potentially I've seen stories where like people get deported and like there's no contact. How do you actually get divorced?
So you can still file for divorce and you have to be able to sign an affidavit of diligent search that you've looked for this person because you can serve somebody anywhere in the world. So obviously a little more complicated than if they're in your state, but it's possible to be done. And if you cannot find them, then you serve by publication. The court has some limitations in what they can order, but they can certainly order a dissolution of marriage. So it is completely possible. You just have to jump through a few more steps.
Okay. I'm so glad we're talking about this because honestly, I feel like more people need to know the divorce process before they even start talking about getting married because it's just like that's the shit that nobody talks about, right? It's like more often than not, this is like an area of your life that you literally don't know anything until you're confronted with the situation. And I think just knowing like all the potential things that are at stake would make people be a lot more diligent and like thoughtful about the process of getting married, knowing like what is potentially on the other side.
Yeah, it's complicated, but I have to insist that it doesn't have to destroy your life, right?
Yeah.
I mean, as difficult as it can be, and again, emotionally overwrought, the process can be simplified. It's divorce, legal proceedings are not the place to hash out your emotions. And we live in a world now where the laws are pretty clear. I mean, the laws do vary state by state. But there is an overall consensus on how the issues are being dealt with. And so it's in your power to facilitate a smooth and simple and efficient divorce. That's what my platform is, my online divorce platform aims to do for people. Because to lose your money in divorce with lawyers is silly. It's money from your retirement account. It's money from the equity in your house. It's money from that you're depriving yourself and your children of, when at the end of the day, for the most part, the laws are fairly clear on how we're going to resolve your issues. And so I think, again, it's a lot about personal responsibility for the process, informing yourself and not making mountains out of molehills and proceeding with an eye towards solution.
Yeah. So tell us about your company, thequickdivorce.com. How does this help folks get to that finish line faster and without potentially losing thousands of dollars in legal fees?
Well, for one, it's a flat fee system. Like if you hire me in my law firm, you're paying my hourly rate. This is a flat fee. It works at your pace. Parties have their own logins. So there's security and, we aim to make sure that your privacy is protected and you can handle your divorce from beginning to end through the platform. And we can even electronically file for you and stay with you until you have a final judgment.
Wow. Is this only for folks located in Florida or is this like nationwide? You can use this?
For now, we're only in Florida, but our plans are to expand nationwide.
Amazing. And I'm assuming this is a situation where like it's an amicable divorce where there's not like child custody issues potentially or like just complex stuff.
Well, there can be complex matters, right? Because the platform is very robust. So you can have multiple assets or have none. You can have a lot of debt or have none. You can have one child or have 6. The platform is designed to be able to withstand and withhold a variety of circumstances. The requirement is that you agree. that you're able to work through the system in an amicable way and ultimately reach an agreement.
Yeah. At the end of the day, I think that's what people want out of this process more than anything. It's just like, let's just stop trying to destroy each other and let's move on. Because that's the whole point. That's why you file for divorce. You just want to get back to regular life as quickly as possible. And so if there's ways that we can do that through the quickdivorce.com and the work that you do, Aliette, I think it's such a valuable asset, especially to our community, because again, like we mentioned earlier in the conversation, this is still such a taboo topic, but unfortunately, I think it is impacting more and more people in our community. And so the more that we talk about this, the more that people can feel like they're less alone in this process. There are solutions. And it doesn't have to be this like traumatizing thing. This can be the start of a brand new life if you approach it that way.
Exactly. And two things. One, it was very important to me that the platform be bilingual. So everything is in Spanish and in English. The agreement can be read in Spanish because I know that we feel more comfortable in our native language, right? And so we're the only platform that is bilingual. That was very important to me because as a Latin person, it was important to me to be able to reach them and provide that level of comfort. And I think the other thing is that it's time to sort of flip the switch on that narrative that divorce is this dramatic, chaotic, you have to have the fighter lawyer. You don't need that. I mean, I listen to my own prejudice because I also run a law firm, but there are always going to be people who need to fight. But again, 85% of cases are already handled with people without lawyers. It does not have to be a battle. It does not have to be a war. And I think that's the message that for me, I'm very passionate about putting forward because I see how handling my divorce in an amicable way has preserved the integrity of my relationship with my ex-husband and has shielded my children from that litigation, that angst, that emotionally draining experience. And it's been a very positive experience for us in general.
That's fantastic. For folks that want to find out more about you and your firm, where can we find you?
Well, my law firm is carolanfamilylaw.com. And my online platform is thequickdivorce.com or in Spanish, eldivorciorapido.com.
Amazing. And we'll make sure to link all of those resources in the episode show notes. Aliette, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you. It's been a real pleasure.